Let's review the progress we've made on figuring out what philosophy is. And let's begin by just reviewing the central questions of philosophy that we've outlined and the ones that we're going to be looking at during the course of this semester. We said that I said that the central, remember, philosophers are looking to fundamental questions, the answers to fundamental questions in three specific areas. The first of which I mentioned is knowledge. And when you're talking about questions of knowledge, the branch of philosophy that is looking, or what the branch is called that looks into questions of knowledge, is epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. And I mentioned that epistemology, the way it gets that word, was the root comes from the Greek word episteme, E-P-I-S-T-E-M-E, which is a Greek word for knowledge. There are actually a few words in Greek for knowledge. So philosophers' theory of knowledge is a branch of philosophy, and one of the central questions is the problem of knowledge and skepticism. In particular, I mentioned we're going to be looking at what our philosophers, the philosophers of the period that we're studying, have to say about whether we can have knowledge of the external world or whether skepticism about the external world is true. We went over, remember we talked about the movie The Matrix and kind of the doubts that leaves you with when thinking about whether we really know anything about the external world. And on the flip side of that, there are questions about reality. That is, questions in the branch of philosophy known as metaphysics or ontology. Ontology coming from the Greek word ontos, being. So the study of existence or reality, that's what metaphysics is all about. And the two problems that we talked about briefly were the mind-body problem. Remember, we talked about the zombies. Are we the same as a zombie? Can a zombie actually, can there be a zombie? Or will it not be able to function? Will it not be like us, that we're different, we have consciousness? And we talked about freedom and determinism. We like to think that our actions are free, nothing causes them, but it sometimes appears that nothing happens as a result of an accident. And we outlined the different positions that we could take with respect both to epistemology and with respect to metaphysics. With respect to knowledge of the external world, we talked about a position that was known as skepticism, we don't know anything, and cognitivism, we know stuff, and there are two brands, and we know stuff about the external world based on two factors: reason or experience. First being rationalism, the view that it's based on reason, that our knowledge of the external world is ultimately based on experience, is known as empiricism. With regard to our metaphysical problems, on the mind-body problem, we said there are people who are dualists, think that there are two kinds of substances that make up people. That is, we have these mind or spirit or soul and mental kind of thing, and a body, a physical kind of thing. So there's this duality, and there were a couple of options as to how mental and physical things, events, happen. We talked about interactionism, the idea that they move in parallel, and then there was epiphenomenalism. That is, that the mind, the mental events are conscious events, or epiphenomena. That is, they're sort of byproducts. Something happens that's caused by a physical event, but the causation doesn't go in the other way. Then we talked about freedom and determinism, whether our actions are caused or whether we really are free, and whether those two are compatible. So, those are two major areas in philosophy that we're going to see that the philosophers we're studying are going to provide answers for these questions and probably take views that we've seen. We mentioned briefly value, questions of value in ethics, good, evil, right, wrong. We were talking about the justification of a moral standard. We said kind of a sub-branch, political philosophy, the moral justification of moral standard with respect to the state or society. And one thing we didn't look at, but there are also questions in value of beauty. Philosophers talk about that. And actually, in our course, we're probably not going to spend much time, if any, on these questions. You should know that these are philosophical questions. If you're interested in ethics, we actually teach a course in ethics, and you can sign up for that. We also teach for the art majors who are interested in figuring out what beauty is. We teach a course in aesthetics. Now the question is, how on earth do you decide one of these theories is right or it's wrong? There are good reasons to believe, or there aren't good reasons provided for it, or a particular philosopher has a good reason or lacks the good reason for doing that. And the tool that one will use, as mentioned earlier, is logic, and we'll spend a little time on logic. And then, other than things that fit in these three buckets or having to do with logic that helps us give answers, we also talked about the problems philosophers talk about in philosophy or religion that kind of span, and as you've seen, they span both questions in epistemology of knowledge, that is, how can you know that God exists, for example, reality, can you prove that God exists? Is it true that God exists or doesn't exist? And we saw the positions that we take: atheism, theism, and agnosticism. And I hope you get an idea what that is. And I did mention that in addition to these questions of, and by the way, philosophy of religion also, there are views in ethics that are based on what the basis of or the justification of the moral standard is a certain religious belief or a certain religion. And finally, we mentioned there are these things that we call philosophy of, and kind of fill in the blank, philosophy of science. Philosophy which asks you fundamental questions about science, what makes a good inference in science, what's the scientific method, how does it provide us with knowledge, what does it tell us about the world, language, philosophy of mind, really questions that we've looked at in metaphysics, philosophy of mathematics, what is the nature of numbers, what is the nature, how do we know these sorts of things, philosophy of law, same kind of questions throughout this. So we see there are a certain set of fundamental questions, and obviously having the right answer to this, getting at the truth, is the goal of philosophy. So they're looking for the fundamental questions, they're looking for the answers to these fundamental questions. We've talked about what some of these questions are, and we now have to spend a little time, we're going to spend a little time talking about what are the positions of the philosophers that we're going to be studying, and why are they so important. Just to give you an idea, the reason that they're so important is the philosophers that we're studying have provided the foundational views for all of the basic positions you can take to answer any of these questions. And what we have to do is figure out which guys were right and which guys were wrong. And as I said, so in next section we're going to talk about who these guys are just in general and give an overview of their positions on various subjects, so you get an idea of the period of history of philosophy, 17th and 18th century for the most part, that really brought forth philosophy as we know it in modern times, questions that we understand and value today. And once we go through that next time, in the next section, the following section, we're just going to think for a little bit while. We're going to think about a little while is the question of logic. How do you justify? What gets you to the right answers to these questions?